Good day. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to bias interviewers towards you in job interviews. And right from the start, the targeted audience of this content is senior roles. And if you're just getting started building your star answers, I would suggest you stick with that approach to build a story bank and eventually get back afterwards, because this is pretty advanced. Okay, the first thing I'd like to talk about here would be to give them what they want to hear in job interviews. Okay, so in other words, it's critically important that you understand why the question is asked and to highlight that skill. Sometimes you don't even have to answer the question, but rather to understand which behavior they're interested in and to target your best story using that behavior. Okay, for example, tell me about the time when you failed. They would be interested in you emphasizing growth, learning, and ownership, right? What's the best story you have in your story bank that emphasizes growth, learning, and ownership? Okay, even if it's not a failure, okay, but this is what they're interested in. Okay, or a time when you found a problem, or when you found two problems which led to a third. Okay, they'd be interested in your analytical thinking. Okay, so they couldn't care less about how big of a problem were those two problems which eventually led to a third, but they're interested in how you reason, your qualitative and quantitative way of thinking, your analytical rigor, if you want, in the process, right? And maybe one more. If they ask you, tell me about the time when you got negative feedback from your manager, they're not asking you this in order to find out if you made peace with yourself and with these things, but they're asking you a time when you had a conflict with your manager because they are interested in your ability to build trust, right? Your composure, your rapport, and how you eventually also learn and improve from that experience, right? So what is your best experience of building trust with your manager? Okay, maybe it's not an actual conflict, but you could picture it as such, so long it emphasizing or building trust, composure, rapport, and improvement. Okay, second thing I want to talk about here, in job interviews, you will not always have an answer, or at least an immediate answer to the question you're getting asked. So what can you do here? Well, what best candidates do in order to avoid, saying nothing for 2 minutes, they would rather start on a hypothetical note. For example, how do you prioritize? Well, I would start here, I would start there, and you would go hypothetically for 10 or 20 or 30 seconds. Oh, and a specific example of a time when I prioritize something would be this. And then you would put your star answer, your best story with the star answer, right? So in a behavioral interview, the difference is never being made on your ability to answer a question, right? So the behavioral interview questions are designed so that anyone has an answer for them. The difference is in the details on how qualitative these answers are. So there should be a reason, an extra reason for you to pause after getting asked the question in order to find your best possible answer, right? The third topic I'd like to talk about here with respect to significantly improve your chances to pass behavioral interviews and to do exceptionally well, because that's ultimately the goal, as I just said, would be that interview questions are super easy to predict nowadays. So you can actually quite easily predict, and not only predict, but prepare them all in advance, okay? For example, if you go to a list of 100 most commonly asked interview questions, you will touch upon 95% of those key behaviors involved, right? So I'm not suggesting you should memorize answers to 100 interview questions, but rather to prepare for all possible scenarios, because they're quite a lot easier to predict if you know how to read a little bit between the lines, and if you are, if you build a bit of skill in a bit of, your ability to click faster in order to answer the question you're getting asked, even if they're slightly rephrased, right? They can only rephrase these questions so they sound more counterintuitive, but the core behaviors remain the same for 10 years ago. Okay. Point number 4 to bias interviewers towards you in behavioral interviews is that you can use your best stories more than once. Okay. And the reason why this is important is because so many candidates prepare 20, 40, 50 stories, which they never revise, but they say, hey, I have a variety of stories I can use in my job interview. When in fact, in a behavioral interview, the best candidate is the one with their best stories, right? So if you have 10 stories or 15 stories, right, which you can maybe spin a little bit with multiple interviewers, you're always going to be perceived better when compared to a candidate with 50 story, which they probably never revised, right? Now, interviewers are also interested that you have a variety of experiences, right? So in other words, if you'd be using, in theory at least, if a candidate would only have one story and they would spin it with all interviewers, they would still be the best candidate due to the definition of behavioral interview. Now, interviewers are a bit smarter, so they know where to look, do you have enough experience for the role? And one way to overcome these possible repetitions in your best stories would be to zoom in and zoom out of those experiences to only present the key behavior involved, right? Maybe a story about analytical rigor also emphasized a little bit of conflict resolution, right? So you could use it in both scenarios, but you would zoom in for the conflict resolution specifically, and maybe you would zoom out a little bit on the analytical thinking. So you can exhibit both within the same story, which would still be the best story to use. But always use your best stories in behavioral interviews, right? And technique number 5, and again, I'm speaking here in the context of people who interview relatively well and who are not just getting started with preparing their job interviews, would be to omit key details from your stories, such as even the results or some interesting metrics in your stories, in a bid to build conversation. Okay, so if you're confident about your ability to interview, if you consider that, hey, it's in your interest to interview with them and to create conversation, you can also omit key details of your highlights of your answers, because they will almost always inevitably follow up. Right? One of the reasons that you're advised to use the STAR format is not to forget to talk about something, right? But you can be sure that interviewers will have something that's called a STAR worksheet, in which they have to look for, hey, did this guy talk about results? If you did not mention results, hey, but what about the results? Did you have any results there? They won't disqualify you because you forgot to talk about the results, but they would challenge you on what were the results. And this is how you would build conversation. And if you feel like this technique could be to your favor, which oftentimes happens for salespeople, right? The salespeople are usually good at interviewing, so they like building conversation because they drive the conversation their way. And if this would help you to reach your goals, in my experience, it's also a very common technique with people who can interview well, right? Last but not least, I must emphasize again that the goal is not only to have solid story bank, which is of course critically important, but also about delivery and to keep momentum and demonstrate that you have senior level judgment. You can think on your feet and to always guide the conversation towards your strength. Okay, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.